Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. Today we're talking about Samantha Harvey's Orbital. Sometimes here on the Foxed Page, I'll read a book, and honestly, the thing that's kind of driving my reading of the book is that I get to talk to you all about it and I get to really think through it after I'm finished. This was a book that was fascinating to me. I really liked it. I'm not sure that I would say I loved it, but wow, was it really excellent to dig into. This is a book that was recommended to me by my very smart sister-in-law, then my husband read it, then it won the Booker Prize. Maybe not quite in that order, but for some reason it was a book that I was resisting. Then when all of these summer reading lists came up and it came out and it was cropping up on all of these different lists, I was like, okay, it's time. It's time to take a look at this book. And I read it really quickly because I think it is kind of a propulsive read. I think you really are invited to really dig in and read it fairly quickly. And I had so many questions, which is why it has been so fun to pull together this lecture. And quickly before we dive into the book, I feel the need, because I think there may be some new listeners out there. Summer reading always brings a bunch of new listeners to the podcast. I feel like I need to explain what the Foxed Page means. So foxing is simply those little tiny like brown speckles that you might see in a very old, very beloved book. And that's actually an interesting point to bring us into this conversation of Samantha Harvey's Orbital, which is that Samantha Harvey has talked in interviews, which I listened to many, about the fact that she is a huge fan of Virginia Woolf. She is a teacher, and one of the books that she returns to again and again and again when she's teaching is Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway is one of my favorite books, and we are at the centenary of that book. It is 100 years since that book was written. So in some ways, it seems very fitting that we have a book, Orbital, which on the face of it doesn't quite seem like it is a very Mrs. Dalloway sort of book. And yet in many ways, it is a very Mrs. Dalloway sort of book, which we're going to talk about. So for those of you who like an agenda, here's what we're going to get up to today. We're going to talk about what this book is. So at different points, Samantha Harvey and other people have called this a space pastoral. People have called it realist fiction. People have called it nature writing. And mostly by people here, I mean Samantha Harvey herself. And a lot of times the genre of something is not that important. But in a book that is kind of strange like this, and a book that's asking us to really think about different ways to engage with fiction, I think it is interesting to take a look at how we might categorize it as fiction, because it really does open up, I think, what she is trying to do. So we're going to talk about what this book is. Then we're going to talk about how she pulled it off. I literally had, there were several different parts all throughout the book, but especially toward the beginning, where I literally wrote, how is she doing this? Because the description is so incredible. Obviously, Samantha Harvey has not been to outer space. Do we say outer space? I'm not sure that we even say that. That sounds like something from Star Trek or something. But she has not been orbiting the Earth. And yet it seemed so accurate, which is going to bring us back to this idea of the realist novel. In many ways, this book is very realist. I'm going to argue that it is also quite modernist. But this is a book that is really grounded in the day-to-day experience of living on the International Space Station and highly grounded in this idea of looking back at Earth. And I was like, how? How is she making this feel so, so real? And I'll tip my hand a little bit. She read a lot of books by astronauts. And I was very pleased to hear, both for her, but also for myself, that when she did get feedback from astronauts, it was very moving for them to read this, because of the idea that astronauts are maybe not, exactly like wordsmiths. Most of the people who are up in space are not poets and not writers and not necessarily people who can articulate things as well as Samantha Harvey can. And I was so happy to hear. Honestly, I wouldn't have really cared if it were not that accurate. It's not. I was very moved by the book in ways that sort of stand aside from whether or not it's true. But it was extra great to hear that, in fact, this really resonated with the experience of people who have actually been in space. So after we talk about how she pulled it off, we're going to talk about the limits of language and how she kind of gets around the limits of language. Obviously, when you think about what she has done, I have this book sitting here, it's, 207 pages long. It's, paper. It's ink and paper with a very beautiful cover. But it's ink and paper, and somehow she has created in the minds of hundreds of thousands of people. I don't know how many copies this book has sold, but she has given us what is a very accurate view to carry around in our imagination And she did it with words, which is just it's like incredible to me. So I want to talk about the limits of language and how she both problematizes that, she acknowledges that, and then also moves beyond in order to sort of supersede the limits of language. Of course, with that, we will be talking about figurative language and actually a lot about Virginia Woolf and the ways that I see both of them as describing things in the same way. We're going to talk about whether this book can be seen as optimistic or pessimistic. We're going to talk about philosophy. She studied philosophy. And then we're going to close with this idea of joy. One of the things that I loved from the interviews that I listened to is that she talked about how she, when she dove into the idea of writing this book, and then as she was moving along through it, there was a certain amount of kind of joy and ecstasy. And she even said there was kind of this feeling of like this thrilling kind of feeling. And she equated it to being in love. And she really wanted to express and sort of infuse the book with all of this joy. And I think she has done it. It's a book that in some places is very dark. It's very sad. But it also throughout has this kind of sense of awe that she talks about as being joy. And I loved the idea of going back and looking at a couple of choice passages of prose that really do convey that sense of joy. So we're going to dive into this question of like, what is this book? At some point, someone asked this like question that drives me crazy, which is like, if you had to put it on a bookstore shelf, which one of the shelves would you put it on? And she is adamant about the fact that this is a novel. This is fiction, which seemed actually very obvious to me. But what was more interesting were the ways that she was describing this book. So the idea of it being a space pastoral was really interesting to me. I think I was working with a fairly strict definition of a pastoral, which is, something that is set in a bucolic state, and it's kind of something that's really infused with nostalgia. It often has a lot of romance. You've always got like a shepherd and a shepherdess, and it harkens back to a time of real simplicity. So I was like, I don't really see the space pastoral thing. But then she was talking about how this International Space Station, which is, up there, and it's been up there for 25 years continuously, maybe 23, but, 23, 25-ish years. And she described the fact that the actual space station itself is getting kind of rickety, which I was like, oh gosh, that does not sound good. But this idea of it not being as technologically advanced as you might think it would be. At one point in the novel, she describes like a crack in it. Apparently, there is actually a crack in it. So what she's talking about there is this idea of nostalgia and being slightly nostalgic for kind of for a simpler time when technology was slightly less advanced. But also she really leaned into the idea of the international nature of the space station and how in some ways she sees that as like maybe a little bit quaint, as the space race continues and as people are getting more, determined to be on the moon and on Mars, it does make that idea of a bunch of astronauts and cosmonauts, who are just floating around the Earth recording things. They make that seem a little bit quaint as opposed to this idea of, trying to get off of this burning planet of ours and colonize something like Mars. By the way, I looked up the difference between a cosmonaut and an astronaut, and I had sort of surmised this throughout because of context clues, but a cosmonaut is simply a Russian astronaut, or maybe another way of saying that is an astronaut is a non-Russian cosmonaut, and that seems like a very subtle thing, but all throughout the novel, I was so struck by how carefully she balanced all of these international feelings. So there were all sorts of different ideas of people representing their entire countries and how fraught that was. And I kept doing this thing where, obviously she's English, and we have Nell, who is English, and we have Sean, who is the American. But I kept in this very egocentric and very American-centric way, I kept feeling like the third-person narrator was American, which sounds so weird, but I think it's kind of human nature. Partly because I was just so identified with this third-person narrator. But it's so interesting, the care with which she is representing all of them, and just small semantics, like including the word cosmonaut when she's talking about the Russian astronaut. I think there's actually more than one Russian cosmonauts. But that kind of like honoring the semantics of these different international contingents really does speak to the way that she is respecting all of them and trying to put them all sort of on this equal playing field and really digging into this idea of the peace among them despite all of the strife and all of the war that is happening on Earth. So the space pastoral, sure, I understand elements of that and was interested to think about it. but it didn't really that wasn't the thing that jumped out at me as the best way to understand the novel. She also talked about it as nature writing, and I really liked that because the description of Earth is incredible. Certainly when we have the idea of the typhoon, it ends up being, nature writing that's very different from a lot of nature writing. I mean, I don't read a ton of nature writing. So I did like this idea of nature writing, but was still not totally convinced that that was how to apprehend this novel as a category and as a whole entire entity. The one that I liked best is this idea of this as being literary realism. And she reiterated that again and again in different interviews, and there were a couple of different people who really dug into that idea with her. And I want to talk a little bit about how this lens of literary realism can help us understand and appreciate the book even more. So the idea of realism, if you've listened to the Foxed page before, I have my standard kind of definition of realism. It starts essentially with 1851 with the publication of Madame Bovary. Think of people like Henry James, John Steinbeck, who's much later, but in that same vein. It is writing that seeks to be fairly democratic in the sense that it is talking about a whole swath of humanity. It's also writing about the mundane. It's a writing about, that shows us everything about the characters. It is an attempt to encompass a whole entire world and to create that whole entire world for the reader. The way that is done is through a lot of detail. So we're getting very mundane detail about what people are eating, where they're going to the bathroom, how they're cleaning their houses, in an attempt to really, place the reader in a very believable world. It also almost always has a third-person narrator and a very omniscient third-person narrator. Especially in Steinbeck, this is kind of a thing where you have, he starts from way off above the Salinas Valley and is describing, the way that the Salinas Valley was shaped over millennia. I think he does that. I might really just be exaggerating a little bit, but it's this kind of big sweeping description, and then we kind of go into the valley and we move into a smaller community of people, and we follow the story from there. And there were so many aspects of Orbital that fit right into this. We certainly have, it's not so much a democratizing thing. It's not talking about class stuff necessarily, but it is talking about this universal experience that is kind of everyman. I mean, these astronauts and cosmonauts are people who are everyday folks, who always had this dream. I was so interested in the way that all of them, from the time they were tiny children, had this really serious investment in the idea of going to space. There are three things that keep coming up from this novel. One is the fact that they had to do all of that training, in those caves. The idea of spending weeks in caves with people, under, these ocean kind of caves, sounded so insane to me. It sounded way worse than actually being on any kind of international space station. That stuck with me. The idea of that moment in the novel when the mice start flying around in the cage, that is just I can't get that out of my head. And in such a delightful way. It's such a moment of joy, but also a complex moment in the novel. The third thing I can't get out of my head, and I'm digressing here a bit from the idea of realism, although this is all very germane, is something that my daughter told me, which is when the International Space Station was first being established, we had the American part and we had the Russian part, which she alludes to, although there's not a lot of talk about, the origins of the International Space Station. But my daughter was telling me that there was all of this stuff where no one, the two parts were going to fit together, and no one wanted to be the male part penetrating. Well, no, sorry, everybody wanted, both parties wanted to be the male part that penetrated the female part. So you would have two interlocking things, and one would obviously be more vaginal and one would be more phallic. And nobody wanted to be the vaginal part, which, I mean, oh my gosh, people, come on. So they had to engineer this thing where it was kind of this interlocking thing, but it did not have anything to do with penetration. And in many ways, I'm fascinated by the idea of Samantha Harvey as a woman writing a story about space that does have to do with this idea of, colonizing things, and this idea of vanquishing space, and this idea of national pride. But at the same time, all of that is totally diminished with the sense of the international vibe of this place. And most of all, sort of the mundane community, and one that is experiencing so much awe. So to go back to this idea of why this is realist, we have this democratizing element. We certainly have the mundane. I mean, a lot of this is, the people doing their small jobs. And I loved the level of detail, the idea that, things had to be stuck with Velcro, and how when they cried, the little tears might just go out into the air as little blobs. So we have all of these elements that feel very much like the realist novel, but then everything is always kind of strange, which is so fitting and seems kind of obvious. But the strangeness is so interesting because it not only allows us to see this whole new world, but it also allows us to look at our own world through the lens of something that is so different. Another element of the realist novel is that you have, some kind of plot. If you look at Madame Bovary, you look at Anna Karenina, you look at all of these different novels, East of Eden, What Maisie Knew, all of these have, plots where a lot is happening. She really challenged herself to write something that was not plot heavy. One of the things she really was insistent upon was not having conflict. She called conflict the real driver of plot, which makes total sense to me. But it was extremely important for her to write it. The whole thing takes place in one day, and she just wanted it to reflect one of the days in the lives of these characters. Very much like Woolf, people say this is a novel where not much happens. I, of course, would beg to differ. We have a lot of different things that are happening throughout the novel, but all of them are firmly grounded in the mundane, and there isn't any kind of, your normal discernible plot. So I want to take a slightly closer look at a couple of these different elements. One is the narrator. So we're going to dive on in here and take a look at how this third-person narrator is functioning. So as we open the book, I'm going to pass right by this first illustration. I have to say, when I first picked up the book and I looked at this illustration that shows all of the orbits, in some ways it was very compelling, but I kind of looked at it and I was like, I do not understand what is happening here, which was really interesting to think about retrospectively, because this illustration of the orbits really didn't give me any sense of what this was like. And so you have this idea of this graphic depiction that really, didn't do a lot for me. And what did do a lot for me were the words. So instead of a visual kind of map of what's happening, what was much more compelling here was what she created with all of the text. So we're going to dive on in. I'll make the very quick aside that I love the cover and I love the title. We're not going to dig too much into all of that. So I want to take a closer look here at not only the gorgeous prose, but at how this third-person narrator is functioning. On page 1, the title of the chapter is Orbit -1. Rotating about the Earth in their spacecraft, they are so together and so alone that even their thoughts, their internal mythologies, at times convene. Sometimes they dream the same dreams, of fractals and blue spheres and familiar faces engulfed in dark, and of the bright, energetic black of space that slams their senses. This is so gorgeous. I mean, what a treat to go through and read this stuff aloud and really parse what it is that makes the prose so incredible. I will say from the top, Samantha Harvey is a poet, and it really shows. Just even the last part of that, slams their senses. All of that repetition of the sibilants is so good there. But what I want to look at here is this third-person narrator. So right away, we have this idea of pulling back. They're rotating around the Earth. She's describing from very far away, which is one of the hallmarks of a third-person narrator. Obviously, a first-person narrator who's like, I did this and I did that. They're not starting from far, far away. And right away, we have this plural third-person thing happening where she's describing them as they. They are a unit. And what she's talking about from the very beginning is the unity of these people. So you can understand why you would need a third-person narrator who's not seated in the consciousness of one of the characters, but who can really describe them as a totality. I was so interested to hear that in the beginning, first of all, she wanted no characters, and then she realized that that would be kind of a heavy lift for the reader if there were, in fact, no characters in the novel. But then she wrote things from Nell's perspective, and she talked about how Nell was the character she ended up feeling like she knew the most. But it's really interesting to me, and I think very apt, that she moved from sort of having the focus be slightly more from one person to really diffusing it across a bunch of people. And she did talk about how freeing that was to realize that she could inhabit all of these different perspectives. It's so genius. And what's nice about this, too, is it's very familiar. This is a very familiar way. In some ways, the novel is very experimental, but this third-person narrator is very straightforward and is telling us stuff that is very much, it feels very familiar to us. But then, in the second paragraph, we immediately move to this thing that is very, it's just description of something that is both kind of very, mundane and very relatable, but also so strange. So in that second paragraph, we're right at the very beginning of the novel. She says this: "They hang in their sleeping bags A hand span away, beyond a skin of metal, the universe unfolds in simple eternities. Their sleep begins to thin, and some distant earthly morning dawns, and their laptops flash the first silent messages of a new day. The wide awake, always awake station vibrates with fans and filters. Oh my gosh, here, listen to that, slams their senses and fans and filters. This is absolutely the writing of a poet. So what's interesting here, we have laptops and we have sleeping bags. Like, this idea of a sleeping bag is it's actually very tactile. It's so great because it is so familiar. There's something kind of childlike about it. There's something kind of not quite romanticized, but you think of camping, which is kind of this rarefied, kind of a special experience, but also very, very familiar. So we have them in sleeping bags, which everyone can relate to, but they're hanging in their sleeping bags. So we have this thing that allows us to feel like we can understand them. We've shared the experience of a sleeping bag, but certainly not one that is hanging in space. And then immediately she moves from this very kind of, cozy feeling of this group of people who dream the same dreams and who have the same thoughts, and they're in their sleeping bags, which we can relate to all of that, and it feels very sort of good and cozy. But then a hand span away, we have the universe unfolds in simple eternities, which is just this gigantic way of thinking. So we have something that's very mundane, and then right outside, she's beginning to introduce this idea of the expanse of what is around them. Then, of course, we have the laptops, which is also so relatable. It was so interesting how almost everything she was talking about on the space station, the fans and the toilets and the cage that the mice were in and all of these different elements, again, the forks, all of it was stuff that was not that difficult to imagine, which is actually a real feat. So she has this incredible third-person narrator, but one of the things she's doing with it that is so effective and is actually kind of different, everything about this novel is both sort of straightforward but also different, is that she does have direct address. So direct address is just where an author will say you, or sometimes it's we. And in this case, it is so effective. There's at one point she says, you already know, blah, blah, blah. And she's really talking about the reader. And whenever there's direct address in a novel like this that is almost entirely in a third-person narrative stance, to me, it's always like so moving and kind of calls for like a little frisson, when you're like, oh my gosh, wow, they're talking directly to me. And then there are a couple of very important times when she'll say we humans, and it moves from this incredible, sense of these astronauts as all being together and forming a unit, then it widens out to not only, contain all humans, but also to very pointedly say we humans. It is such a great way to build intimacy with the reader. There are also a couple of times, and it's a third person, but it uses you. For example, on page 56, so in this example, actually, we're talking about the fisherman who is on Earth. It says, it's easier to have nothing much to lose than to keep losing something. So you stay, and you look up to the restless night sky where your unlikely astronaut friend spends his days and emails you crazy photos of Samar, your island, in its turquoise seas. So it's this incredible trick where the reader, because it says you stay, the reader is aligned with the person in the novel, but we are still very firmly talking about the person from a distance. It is such a good way to build intimacy. So we've talked about this idea of all the ways this is an example of literary realism and how effectively she is creating so much verisimilitude. It feels very real to us and very clear because of all the excellent details and how well we can relate to them. But what I would argue is that, yes, this is a very good example of realism, but it's also a step toward modernist literature. So when we think of modernist literature, it's experimental literature in sort of the 20s and 30s of the last century. It had a lot to do with the First World War and the idea of the cataclysmic sense then of the fragility of life and the idea that we needed a whole new way of using words in order to describe essentially the complexities of life that were not really fitting well into this kind of very straightforward realist fiction. So, of course, the biggest practitioner, well, not the biggest, but my favorite practitioner of modernism is Virginia Woolf. We also have James Joyce. We have Faulkner in the United States. We have a bunch of different poets, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound. But I want to focus a little bit on the idea of Mrs. Dalloway. So when you think about Mrs. Dalloway, we have a third person narrator. It opens with this idea of Clarissa is going to buy the flowers herself, or Clarissa said she'd buy the flowers herself. So we have a narrator who has pulled back. Already in that case, he's kind of I say he because it is a very authoritarian, and frankly, I think the default for a lot of us, given the fact that we live in a patriarchy, is this idea that if there is any kind of gender to a third person omniscient narrator, sometimes I think I do really think of it as being kind of like a male voice. So this voice, let's just, hope it's not that gendered, is focusing kind of from the beginning on Clarissa. That is not the case in Orbital. She is really very carefully focusing on all of the astronauts and cosmonauts as a unit. But the thing she is doing, which is very much like what happens in Woolf, is she is very subtly moving from the consciousness of one of the characters to the next. So we're in Clarissa's consciousness, but then we move. At one point we are in Peter Walsh's, at one point we are in Septimus Smith's, at one point we are in Lucretia Smith's. And that was such a revolutionary way to write, because it was taking a lot of elements of the realist novel and then pushing them so that we were very close, still in the third person, we were very close to different people. And not only does Samantha Harvey do that so well in Orbital, but the structure of the book, which we're not going to look at very closely, really takes advantage of that. There's all this weaving. We have the death of the mother of one of the astronauts, and that is something that we return to time and time again. One of them is looking at a postcard of Las Meninas, which we are going to talk about, and that becomes this kind of touch point that we return to again and again. We have the fishermen that one of them is very close to. It's as we are moving into the minds of these different people, we are returning in a way that is in fact very orbital. I mean, the whole thing is about these cycles and returning and going around and around the same thing. We have that broken down into each one of the astronauts and sort of this cyclical way that they are moving through their day. So I want to take a second and read something that Samantha Harvey said about Mrs. Dalloway. This is a book I mentioned before that she teaches a lot. So when someone asked if there was a book that informed her writing, what she says is this: perhaps Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I've read it all the way through only twice, I think, but I dip into it often when I'm preparing things to talk about with my students, because its prose springs from the page as fresh and revelatory as it must have been 99 years ago when it was first published. And here's the really important part. I still marvel at the tracery of the language, its nimble, subtle weaving of multiple consciousnesses, and maybe with time and rereading, I find her style more mannered, but also more ingenious. When asked if there's a writer that she admires, literally the question is there a writer you always return to? She says, I admire Woolf probably more than any other writer I can think of. I didn't think about parallels with the waves while writing Orbital, but I can see there's something similar about the way voices surface and dissipate. If the influence was there, it wasn't conscious. Which honestly, I think Woolf would love that because, she's all about subconscious. Quick note that the things that I'm quoting from, it's either from The Guardian or from the Booker Prize websites, both of which have amazing articles on the process of Samantha Harvey writing this book. So I want to move on from this question of what is this novel to a closer look at how she pulled this off. So one of the times in my marginalia, it literally says, how is she doing this? With a bunch of question marks. And I want to read that passage before we talk a little bit about, in fact, how she pulled this off. So on page 36, in the new morning of today's fourth Earth orbit, the Saharan dust sweeps to the sea in 100-mile ribbons. Hazy, pale green, shimmering sea, hazy tangerine land. This is Africa chiming with light. You can almost hear it, this light, from inside the craft. We're going to look more closely at how she's pulling off this description. But I was just how does she manage to get the specificity of the Saharan dust sweeps to the sea? Sure, you could locate the Sahara, but this idea of the dust sweeping to the sea, then this idea of the pale green shimmering sea, hazy tangerine land, and then this notion of how the light would look. This is Africa chiming with light. You can almost hear it, this light, from inside the craft. I mean, that is so ingenious. There she's evoking all of these different senses. She has this kind of synesthetic thing where she's hearing the light. It is so inventive, but it also is just kind of specific. How does she know about the dust and the Sahara and the fact that this is shimmery pale green and it looks like a tangerine color? And here is the answer. The way she did it is that she, first of all, read tons and tons of books by astronauts where they spoke about their experiences. She said in one of the interviews, I think she was an only child, but they moved around a lot. And as a teenager, she was interested in astronauts and the experience of being an astronaut. And she wrote a lot of quotations down by astronauts, which I think is so interesting and actually kind of odd. But then, this was the thing that was most compelling to me. Apparently, she spent hundreds, she herself said hundreds, if not thousands, of hours watching the live feed from the International Space Station. Apparently, it doesn't work very often, which I also thought was funny. And she's not just watching that live feed. Sorry, I misspoke. She was watching that sometimes, but just on the internet, was watching just hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of imagery from space of the Earth. So at first, when I heard that in an interview, I was like, oh, okay, that's how she pulled it off. But then I thought for like one more second, and I was like, it still would not be easy. I mean, yes, you can watch hundreds of hours and be just absolutely in awe and want to convey that sense of awe that you're getting, even from pictures of the Earth from the internet. And actually, you know what I'm going to do now? For the rest of the lecture, I'm going to put in a bunch of images of the Earth from space. So if you're on the YouTube, I can treat you to some of the stuff that maybe she was looking at. So at first I was like, oh, that's how she pulled it off. But then I was like, gosh, it would take, in fact, a real poet and someone with real patience and real dedication to see these things and to identify them and to understand which of them is going to be interesting and which of them is not going to be interesting. And then, in fact, to put it in words that doesn't feel boring and doesn't feel repetitive. I mean, this is a very repetitive book. The same thing is happening over and over again, but it never feels like we're hearing any kind of repetition in the prose. She's so smart, too, to have that idea of this typhoon. So they're watching this, sort of potentially cataclysmic weather event that is happening on Earth. It speaks to how helpless they are. I mean, in some ways they can let the weather people on the planet know, but it really added some drama. But I'm just in awe of the way that she was able to articulate such beauty, and it doesn't surprise me that it's the result of so much dedication of so many hours. She tells a story about how she wrote 5,000 words of this and then tucked it away. Just felt like, why would anybody read something? I haven't been in space. What do I have to say about this experience? So she put it aside and then came back to it kind of by chance. And it was during lockdown that she was doing a lot of this writing. And I love the idea actually of someone as being very contained in a space during lockdown, having that happen on Earth in a very, being sort of localized to a small space, but then spending so much of that time while you are in, your lockdown, looking at something that is so incredibly vast. I really liked the counterpoint there. It's very interesting, actually, to think about all of the different ways that the pandemic would have been infecting, wow, gosh, no pun intended, the way that she is writing this book. So it's one thing to understand, the ways that she was sort of researching this, the way that she sort of pulled it off, but it's totally another to think about how she crafted the language. So she herself, at a couple of different points during the course of the novel, she's speaking to the limitations of language. So on page 83, we have this. Interestingly, this is from the perspective of Nell. This is the character she said she sort of knew the most. So I like the fact that it's Nell who is articulating the difficulty of using language to describe this thing that is, indescribable in many ways. So on 83, we have this. The Earth is a place of circular systems, growth and decomposition, rainfall and evaporation, alive with the cycling of air currents that shunt the weather around the continents. You know this, of course, but in space you see it, the looping weather. This is what Nell could watch all day. A research meteorologist before she became an astronaut, she has an eye for the weather, how the Earth drags at the air. See how the clouds at the equator are dragged up and eastward by the Earth's rotation, all the moist, warm air evaporating off the equatorial oceans and pulled in an arc to the poles, cooling, sinking, tugged back down in a westward curve, ceaseless movement. Although these words, drag, pull, tug, they describe the force of this movement, but not its grace, not its what? Its synchronicity, fluidity, harmony. None of those is quite the word. This is so gorgeous. So I want to pick it apart a little bit because this is the kind of genius that makes the novel, I mean, it's why it won the Booker Prize. It's why it is so successful. It's why it's just such a gorgeous meditation. So in the beginning, the idea, the earth is a place of circular systems, colon, then she has a bunch of stuff. What I like about that is the authoritative nature. I mean, she is not pulling punches, and she herself, we're sort of in Nell's, vista at this point. So, and Nell being a meteorologist, she would have that authority. But what's so beautiful is she's really stating this in a way that helps the reader really trust her. I mean, this is a writer who really knows what she is talking about, or at the very least is really seeming like she knows. So she has this very broad, very kind of omniscient narrator declaration, the earth is a place of circular systems. And then we have this intimacy in the beginning of the very next paragraph. You know this, of course. And that's that example of the second person, the direct address. It's not actually quite direct address, because what she's saying there, like essentially the you here is Nell. You know this, but in space you see it. So the you there is the astronauts, but it is also the reader. When she says, you know this, you're like, yes, I do know this. The earth is circular and it has systems that have to do with weather. So she begins with this giant authoritative statement. And then we have this intimacy of like, you already know this, you do know this stuff. So we're kind of anchored in something we know. And then because we are anchored and grounded, we can follow her into the next part. And then we have this sense of like, yes, she must have spent hours and hours. I mean, I guess you could study weather patterns, to understand how all of this is happening. But you really do get the sense that this is someone who has watched these things happen. But then we have this admission that is so important. She says, although these words, M-, drag, pull, tug, M-, they describe the force of this movement, but not its grace. So we have these words, and it is interesting. They're very monosyllabic, drag, pull, tug. In some ways, they don't feel to me like they describe weather. Like I imagine, sort of mistier things or like big swaths of stuff that looks like cotton. That's the fiber artist in me that is seeing them look like cotton batting, for those of you quilters out there. But in some ways, the drag, pull, tug, they aren't really telling. I actually would argue, if we go back above, evaporating off the equatorial oceans and pulled in an arc to the poles, cooling, sinking. I think there's something about the poles and about the equatorial evaporation. Those words, for some reason, are sort of more evocative. But I'm agreeing with her in the sense that that language clearly has its limitations. And she's very explicit about that. So after drag, pull, and tug, she says, they describe the force of this movement, but not its grace, not its what. And then she has this beautiful thing where she's using slashes, which you would not have known. It sounded maybe like commas. But she says it's synchronicity / fluidity / harmony. And that really is alerting us to this idea. Just the punctuation is highly unusual. She has M-, she has colons, she's having these slashes. It really does give us this sense that these are words that could be, that none of them is quite right. So she's trying them on in a way that's helping the reader understand that this is an impossible task, which honestly gives the reader all the more reason to respect what's happening here. It's just absolutely beautiful. So some of you probably are already thinking about the fact that if you're talking about the limitations of language, one of the things that writers and certainly poets do in order to max out language is use figurative language. But I want to take a look at a couple of the times where she's using metaphor as a way to help the reader understand what this experience is like. So metaphor is obviously just a comparison of two things. And the most effective metaphors are ones where, you're comparing object A with object B, and if the reader knows object B, then they can form a better and more deep understanding of object A. They should be close enough that the reader can kind of make an association, but they need to be far enough apart, different enough, so that it does reveal something to the reader. So I want to take a look at a couple of examples of figurative language. One of them is right at the very start. It's in that very first paragraph. She talks about the bright, energetic black of space that slams their senses. Raw space is a panther, feral and primal. They dream it stalking through their quarters. And I have to say, I picked this book up a couple times before I started reading it in earnest. And I read that first paragraph, and the panther thing was part of the reason why I was like, oof, gosh, I don't know. This isn't really speaking to me right now. I just don't think it's that great. The paragraph is so good. This idea of them all dreaming of fractals and blue spheres and familiar faces engulfed in dark, and of the bright, energetic black of space that slams their senses. I really think she should have stopped there, because then she went on and said, again, raw space is a panther, feral and primal. They dream it stalking through their quarters. I was like, I don't know. I didn't really follow you there. In my marginalia, it says, with like a lot of M's. I'm hoping, that for you, dear reader out there, that was an excellent metaphor. For me, it didn't quite work. And then like 3 pages later, it's almost, I was sort of like, I don't know how the metaphors are going to go. And she finishes this very first brief chapter with kind of a pile up of metaphors. And part of me was like, oh gosh, I'm not sure that the metaphors are exactly the way forward. And luckily, she uses different types of description that are much, much more effective. And even here at the end of the first chapter, when we do have this pileup of metaphors, at the end of it, she is speaking to the fact that none of them quite works. So we have this. The earth is the answer to every question. The earth is the face of an exalted lover. They watch it sleep and wake and become lost in its habits. The earth is a mother waiting for her children to return, full of stories and rapture and longing, their bones a little less dense, their limbs a little thinner, eyes filled with sights that are difficult to tell. So I love the idea of this being difficult to tell, and I like the idea of beginning and finishing this first chapter with the idea that it's very difficult to describe these things. But this pile up, the earth is the answer to every question. It's an exalted lover. It's a mother. The idea of kind of fishing through these different elements makes me think that maybe not even Samantha Harvey thinks that metaphor is the way to go. So I wanted to find an example of this kind of description that to me felt very much like Virginia Woolf, and the book is absolutely rife with it, which I think is excellent. So the type of description that I love her making, we're going to look at an example of it, it's unique. It's kind of far-reaching, and it feels somewhat metaphorical, but they're not actual metaphors for the most part. So what I did, I literally just flipped through the book and looked for a part that didn't have a lot of paragraph breaks. And sure enough, I just sort of stopped in one place and found this absolutely gorgeous description. This happens to be on page 98. At the brink of a continent, the light is fading. The sea is flat and copper with reflected sun, and the shadows of the clouds are long on the water. Asia come and gone, Australia a dark featureless shape against this last breath of light, which is now turned platinum. Everything is dimming. The Earth's horizon, which cracked open with light at so recent a dawn, is being erased. Darkness eats at the sharpness of its line, as if the earth is dissolving and the planet turns purple and appears to blur, a watercolor washing away. One thing I want to alert you to is the modernist bent to a lot of this. So in the middle of To the Lighthouse, which is my favorite novel of all time, there is a section called Time Passes. And in it, we have a lot of personification. Essentially, it is a description of the house where the Ramseys spend their summer. It's a description of that house aging. So we have a lot of natural forces that are acting upon the house, very much the same way that we have natural forces here of weather and wind and sand and mist, all of this happening on the earth. So what we have in this paragraph here, it's a lot of color and it's a lot of movement and description of light. So we have the idea of the sea is flat and copper with reflected sun, and the shadows of the clouds are long on the water. Australia, a dark featureless shape against this last breath of light. And then we have this kind of action of light. The Earth's horizon, which cracked open with light at so recent a dawn, is being erased. Darkness eats at the sharpness of its line. So here we have a little bit of personification. Darkness is eating. As if the Earth is dissolving and the planet turns purple and appears to blur. And then we end with actually what I think is a very beautiful metaphor, a watercolor washing away. It is so genius. It sounds very simple, but she's using it in ways that are so specific and so beautifully in context that it really does evoke this very clear image for us. So before we close by talking about joy and just the beautiful depiction of joy in the novel, before we do that, I want to take a look at 2 different instances of art within art. So I want to look at the postcard of Las Meninas, that really features pretty heavily in the novel if you're wanting to focus on it, and also the photograph of Aldrin and Armstrong that was taken by Collins. So the reason I'm wanting to focus on this is that very cool thing. I'm such a sucker for this. It's sort of like the play within the play in any sort of Shakespearean work. It's also the idea of a fractal. She talks about that in the beginning. I love a good fractal. So for those of you, like, a fractal is basically an element that is found within a larger entity, but that element contains the same thing that the larger entity contains. So it's sort of like we have this big novel that is really concerned with this idea of how to see things and perspective and to look at something that's awe-inspiring. And then within it, we have both a photograph and a postcard of Las Meninas, and both of those are doing the exact same thing. Both of those are talking about perspective and point of view and how it is that we describe something, how we think about something that is a vision that art is offering to us. Basically, it's just like a little mini version of what the novel is doing can be found in each one of those works of art. I'm not sure the Collins photo is a work of art, but, well, probably, yes. I mean, certainly a very important photograph. So, of course, as we are looking at these two examples, we also are looking at the incredible prose that makes this book so unbelievable. So on pages 8 and 9, we have the first glimpse of this postcard. There was a lesson at school, and keep in mind, this is very early. We're really early. And this is a very good example of how specifically we end up knowing the different astronauts. The book is much bigger than just their experience in space because, of course, it is very concerned with their childhoods. I mean, not all of them and not in depth, but a couple of different instances that are important and that inform our experience of who they are in the space station. So on page 8, this is the American. This is Sean. There was a lesson at school about the painting Las Meninas when Sean was 15. It was about how the painting disoriented its viewer and left them not knowing what it was they were looking at. By the way, for anyone on YouTube, I've already put an image of Las Meninas up so you can enjoy exactly what she's talking about. I did find it very satisfying. It's a painting that I know pretty well, but her description, I didn't look at it as I was reading it. Her description of it was so good. It's yet another example of the way she's using words to describe something that should be really difficult to describe because it's an incredible work of visual art. So Sean is 15. The painting is about disorienting the viewer, and we go on. It's a painting inside a painting, his teacher had said. Look closely. Look here. That is such incredible immediacy. I love it. We are like in the classroom with Sean when he's 15. And it's this idea of look here, which of course is, the painting within the painting is talking about the painting within the novel. It's art within art within art. It's unbelievable. Velázquez, the artist, is in the painting at his easel, painting a painting. And what he's painting is the king and queen, but they're outside of the painting where we are, looking in. And the only way we know they're there is because we can see their reflection in a mirror directly in front of us. What the king and queen are looking at is what we're looking at, their daughter and her ladies in waiting, which is what the painting is called, Las Meninas, the ladies in waiting. Here we're playing with language, the idea of words as capturing something. It goes on. So what is the real subject of this painting? The king and queen, and then there's a long digression in parentheses. She uses parentheses very much like Woolf uses parentheses, which I love. So then we have the close parentheses. So it says, what is the real subject of this painting? The king and queen, then the long parentheses, and then, or is it us, the viewers, who occupy the same position as the king and queen, who are looking in and who are being looked at by both Velázquez and by the infant princess, and, in reflection, by the king and queen? Or is the subject art itself, which is a set of illusions and tricks and artifices within life, or life itself, which is a set of illusions and tricks and artifices within the consciousness that is trying to understand life through perceptions and dreams of art? So I just cannot get enough of this. What we are having here, obviously, is a very philosophical interlude, and a book that is about orbiting the Earth really should take on large questions, and this one absolutely does. And any time that she verged into this philosophical realm, I felt like I was in such good hands. So we have this big, big question about what this iconic piece of art is all about, and then, or, the teacher said, is it just a painting about nothing? Just a room with some people in it and a mirror? To Sean, who, at 15, did not want to take art classes and already knew he wanted to be a fighter pilot, this lesson was the height and depth of all futility. Unbelievable. So good. So good. So the coolest thing, I just absolutely love finishing a book and then going back and looking at elements, because once you have finished it, you have a completely different sense about how accurately this whole discussion of this incredible work of art maps onto Orbital itself. Orbital is asking all of these same questions in ways that are unique and entirely different from a Spanish painting, but at the same time are very similar. So that is on pages 8 and 9. It's very early in the novel that she's introducing this question of, like, what is art doing? What is perspective? How significant is, a piece of art? Is it about life? Is it deeply philosophical? Or is it simply a visual image? So we have those questions on pages 8 and 9. And then on pages 158 and 159, we return to the postcard in this way that is so compelling. And importantly, we're fairly well into the novel. It's a 200-page novel. We're sort of 3/4 of the way through. Is that right? That is not right. Wait, is it 5/8? I don't know. Maybe, I think it's 3/4. We'll leave it at that. And as I read through this, one of the things to think about here is the incredible levity in this novel. We are talking about very heady and oftentimes very sad things and the experience of just like crazy awe. But there are times that are very funny in a very subtle way. And she adds this levity that really was effective for me. So on 158, we have this. We have this interaction between Sean and the Italian astronaut. Did someone send you a postcard? Pietro jokes, coming to the doorway of Sean's quarters and nodding at the Las Meninas that's in free drift. Again, here we have this thing that's very mundane. It's a postcard, but it's in free drift. Everything is very, accessible, but also very strange. My wife, 15 years ago, he says. Pietro nods, and Sean nips the postcard from its drift and hands it to him. Read the back, Sean says. And then we have in italics, a little further down. What is the subject of the painting? His wife has written on the postcard's reverse. Who is looking at whom? The painter at the king and queen, the king and queen at themselves in a mirror, the viewer at the king and queen in the mirror, the viewer at the painter at the viewer at the princess, the viewer at the ladies in waiting. Welcome to the labyrinth of mirrors that is human life. Is your wife always so obsessed with petty small talk? Pietro asks. That part just killed me. It's this highly philosophical thing and very convoluted and very big question. And then, of course, this idea that this would be petty small talk. And then Sean, has this nice rejoinder. And Sean replies, I'm telling you, it's relentless. Pietro stares for a while at the painting and a while longer, then says, it's the dog. Pardon? To answer your wife's question, the subject of the painting is the dog. So I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but for those of you who are looking at the painting, it is shocking. All of a sudden, it's a little bit of a Gordian knot situation where all of a sudden your perspective completely shifts. So obviously, the whole point of me reading all of this is because this novel is doing the exact same thing. It's asking questions of whose perspective we are taking, whether we're one of the astronauts, whether we're the fishermen on Earth, whether we are Nell's husband in Ireland. And of course, the answer to that is we are all of these different perspectives, but we are also asking questions about art and what it does for us. It's just an incredible meditation here that she does so effortlessly. It's also just such a joy to read back through this incredible prose. So I want to look very briefly at this photograph because it is so, so much about like space and kind of this iconic look at space. These are people, humans who have actually been in space. Samantha Harvey is very clear about this being a novel. She made up these people. She made up all of their conversations. She made up Las Meninas floating around in Sean's quarters. But it's very helpful when she occasionally talks about the actual moon landing. And this certainly is an iconic vision that lots of us can imagine. But it's so cool to think about it in these philosophical terms that have everything to do with the object of this book. So on 63, we have this. In the photograph Collins took, there's a lunar module carrying Armstrong and Aldrin. Just behind them, the moon, and some 250,000 miles beyond that, the Earth, a blue half-sphere hanging in all blackness and bearing mankind. Michael Collins is the only human being not in that photograph, it is said, and this has always been a source of great enchantment. Every single other person currently in existence, to mankind's knowledge, is contained in that image. Only one is missing, he who made the image. So this is also so effective because it's talking about the vastness that she really conveys so well. So we have this idea of Michael Collins as being the only human who is not in the image, and then we have this. Anton has never really understood that claim, or at least the enchantment of it. What of all the people on the other side of the earth that the camera can't see? And everybody in the southern hemisphere, which is in night and gulped up by the darkness of space. Gulped up by the darkness of space. It seems like darkness is always eating everything. It's just genius. Maybe I'm really leaning into her personification and not so much her metaphors. Okay, and then Anton goes on. Are they in the photograph? In truth, nobody is in that photograph. Nobody can be seen. Everybody is invisible. Armstrong and Aldrin inside the lunar module, humankind unseen on a planet that could easily, from this view, be uninhabited. The strongest, most deducible proof of life in this photograph is the photographer himself. His eye at the viewfinder, the warm press of his finger on the shutter release. In that sense, the more enchanting thing about Collins's image is that, in the moment of taking the photograph, he is really the only human presence it contains. Unbelievable. This is so gorgeous and also so deeply philosophical. I was noticing as I'm reading here, the warm press of his finger on the shutter release. That is the kind of description that we might see in Woolf. It's simple description, the warm press, but it's also so evocative. I mean, the idea of his finger pressing is so minute and so detailed and so mundane. But the idea of the warm press of his finger and shutter release, we almost have that sound that old cameras used to make when you would take a photograph. It's such beautiful prose, but it's also asking some very important questions. And also, in both of these cases where we have art within art, both with Las Meninas and then with this photograph, we have someone making an argument about all of the complexity of what this painting is about, or all of the enchantment of what is in this photograph. And then in both cases, we have someone just kind of very simply and very kind of generously and warmly, and not in like a conflicting way or a combative way, but just in kind of a complimentary way, saying, I don't really see it that way. Las Meninas is a painting of a dog. And really, Collins is the only one who is present in that photograph. We have these ideas of these big philosophical questions being neatly answered, but also turned upside down. So one of the things that Harvey does so well throughout this is really maintain both a sense of like real pessimism and real optimism. So this is a question that I have alluded to, and we'll dig into it a little bit here, which she has said that it is both optimistic and pessimistic. And I think she does an incredible job of maintaining those realities. There was one interviewer in particular who was talking about how this was really like a call to arms about the climate change catastrophe that we are facing. I myself, I have to say, I did toward the end, I was feeling pretty stressed. I am someone who worries a lot about the environment, and it really, pushed a lot of those buttons, to use a crazy metaphor. But I absolutely saw that with this pessimism was this incredible sense of exultation and of joy and of beauty. There's also maybe the promise that we will, in fact, colonize Mars, which obviously she feels ambivalent about. It is a book that is about ambivalence. It is a book that, from the very start, she has been very clear that it is about the mundane, the question of who's going to fix the toilet, together with this absolute awe-inspiring experience that all of them are having, and that she is attempting to allow us to have along with them. So I loved this kind of art within the art, and I think it's really interesting to go back and look at them as another lens through which to appreciate the work. So we're going to close by looking at the very last paragraph on the very last page of the book. And this is a very good example of this kind of joy that she really wanted to maintain, and that she felt, first and foremost, when she was looking at the images of the earth from afar, but also what she was really focusing on as she was writing the book. And before I dive in, she talked about that one of the things that was sort of like a controlling idea throughout the book was this quote by the Dalai Lama that is, be kind whenever possible, it's always possible. And I really thought a lot about that, because part of me was like, kindness, like be kind. Like, what does that mean? How does that inform the writing of a novel? But then I thought about the fact that there isn't conflict among these astronauts. It is not a book that is about conflict. Even when she's talking about war, all of the wars raging on the planet, she's talking about them with a remove and with this idea that they are so futile. There is a kind of kindness that infuses everything about this novel. And I loved the idea of keeping that in mind as I was looking through and preparing the lecture, because it's one of the reasons why the stuff is so appealing. It's appealing because it's infused with both joy and with this kind of kindness that she felt in this quotation. Okay, so we're going to read the very last paragraph, and I'm not going to parse much of this afterward, but as we're reading, just think about kindness and think about joy. And the earth, a complex orchestra of sounds, an out-of-tune band practice of saws and woodwind, a spacey, full-throttle distortion of engines, a speed-of-light battle between galactic tribes, a ricochet of trills from a damp rainforest morning, the opening bars of an electronic trance, and behind it all a ringing sound, a sound gathering in a hollow throat, a fumbled harmony taking shape, the sound of very far-off voices coming together in a choral mass, an angelic, sustained note that expands through the static. You think it'll burst into song, the way the choral sound emerges full of intent, and this polished bead planet sounds briefly so sweet. Its light is a choir. Its light is an ensemble of a trillion things which rally and unify for a few short moments before falling back into the rin-tin-tin and jumbled tumbling of a static, galactic, woodwind, rainforest trance of a wild and lilting world. So beautiful. Incredible prose. I'm going to say there's some very effective metaphors in there. I might have to revise my whole thinking. Subtle metaphors, but very good ones. It is so beautiful. And here I think we really do have this idea of how poetic this is. When you take just that final paragraph, it really does read as poetry in such a compelling way. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that this helped you appreciate Orbital even more. I'm so glad that I finally dug into it. It is just an absolute masterclass in creating art that really has emotion and depth and really shows us what language can do. Just unbelievable. So thank you for tuning in. Happy reading.